What's up everybody? My name is Tyler Davis, the creator of Slovenian Craftsman, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through how I built this plant stand, my design process, and everything that went into it. Stick around and I hope you enjoy. So like all of my woodworking projects, I start off in the sketching phase. And right here, I'm just drawing out what I want this plant stand to look like, its dimensions, and any additional materials I'll need. The design that I'm going for is something similar to a few of my past builds, which are made from 2x2 pine and oak slat accents. A little bit ambitious, but this is what I came up with for the design. Once the sketch is complete, I hop in my car and drive 3 hours up north to New Jersey, make a pit stop off at Check Depot, and spend about $150 on supplies. Once I make it to the shop, it's time for the fun to begin. I start to mark off some dimensions I'm going to need. So for this, I'm just using a tape measure and then a triangle, square, triangle, to make sure that those lines are straight and square. That's probably why it's a square. So right here I'm doing the top piece, and then these are like the side zigzags. You don't see me take in the dimensions of the bottom piece because those are going to be the same as the top. Right here I'm cracking out the good old miter saw, and this tool is super good for making these quick cuts across the wood. It's really good for repeating cuts, and what you could do is you could put up a block like I'm doing right here and clamp it down with a clamp or two. And this way, when you're making those cuts, you can make it the same size cut over and over again. So here I'm finishing up the cuts for the top of the plant stand, which include 10 slats of pine and 4 slats of oak. The good part about a miter saw is you could adjust the angle of your cut. So instead of just cutting straight cuts over and over again, you could change the degree it's at and make cuts at, like what I'm doing right here, like 45 degrees. Now that I have the top and side pieces all cut out, it's time to do the base. And for the base, I'm doing these miter butt joints at a 45-degree angle. And what you have to remember for this is you're creating a trapezoid shape. So you got to make sure you're flipping the wood every time you cut it to make sure you get that shape that you need. Once all the cutting's complete, it's time to lay out the wood in the orientation that I want it in. So I got my dad's help here to pick out which grain's going to be facing the top, and just start organizing all this wood and what orientation I think's best to get it ready for the glue up. Now I'm laying down some newspaper to make sure I don't get any of that glue on the shop table. And once I have my wood in that orientation I laid out earlier, I rotate everything 90 degrees, which is the face that's going to have glue be put on it and spread out evenly. So this way, when it's time for clamping those up, just flip them really quick, press them together, and hopefully it goes smoothly. In this, it didn't go too well. One thing that I had a problem with was this brush was shedding some bristles on the wood, so I was picking it off in between. And these glue ups, you got to move pretty quick because that glue doesn't stay wet forever, and it dries out pretty quick. So just picking off all those bristles I can to make sure that this is flush when they pushed against each other and there's not any gaps in between the wood. Once I'm done squeezing the life out of this top with these clamps and I'm satisfied with the glue up, I prop it up and let it dry. And it's time to move on to the bottom and the side zigzags. So here I'm just laying everything out to make sure it fits the way I want it to, make sure I cut everything correctly. Definitely didn't get the best angle here, but this is what the sides are going to end up looking like. So this is the hardest part of the project, the one I was most intimidated by, and it was gluing those side pieces up together. It's really easy to glue up a flat surface on a flat surface, but trying to glue up two 45-degree angles, your clamps kind of make the wood slide, just doesn't work great. So I ended up getting these 45-degree angle clamps. I think they're mainly made for picture frames. However, they ended up working for this really well. Just one thing that might be better in the future is if these had a little more depth to them. As you can see, there's like a little bit of that wood sticking out from the top. And what happened was when you over clamp these, it kind of bows that wood in and doesn't create like the most flush glue up ever. So you have to be kind of careful with it, and it's a little finicky. So just tighten it enough to where it's sitting flat and just go from there. Now, I'm not going to make you guys sit through and watch me do this 16 times, but got it down to a science here. So just gluing up either side and then clamp it down. And after I'm clamping, what's a really important step, and I'm only going to show it here, is I wipe off all that excess glue around the sides and then in the middle with a screwdriver and a paper towel. And this way, when I go to the sanding process, it's a lot easier because sanding glue is not fun. So you want to try and get as much of that off as possible up front. Now that I have all 4 legs assembled, it's time to mark off the midpoint of each of them. And I'm marking off this midpoint so that I make sure I'm attaching it to the table at the right spot where it's going to be the strongest. I decided to try out something new that I probably won't be doing again for lining up the attachment of these legs to the base. And what I'm doing is hammering a nail into each of those midpoints and then clipping it at the end to create a sharp edge. And this way, I'm just going to imprint down on the wood exactly in the position I want the leg to be and where I want it to be. This didn't work out too great, and I probably won't do it again like I said, but you know what? You got to try new things to get better. And next time I'm just going to measure a bunch of times to make sure everything's lined up well, because this definitely had its flaws with it, but I'm happy I tried it out. Now it's time to get ready to drill holes into the wood, so I mark just over half the length of the dowel onto the bit I'm using so I know when to stop drilling. So when I was drilling the last 2 legs, I went past that tape stopper I had and went through those legs. But we need to move on, and I'll fix that later. Now that all the holes are drilled, it's time for the full glue up. So my game plan, if you want to call it that, is to first glue the legs to the top piece, putting them in place exactly how I want them, and then take the bottom piece, get the dowels and glue on there, and then attach that to the top of the legs that's not attached to the top. And then once those are together, clamp it down while it's all wet. This way it'll be nice and square when I'm clamping it down and really create that nice pressure where the glue could set. On par for the build here, but when I was prepping the bottom piece, I was rushing while hammering the dowels in. And since they're just about at the seam of that 45-degree miter joint, I ended up separating the wood in two of the corners. The first corner, I couldn't believe it, and then the second corner really sealed it in for me. So had to think of something fast because this glue dries pretty quick. Since we're pressed for time here, I made the decision to fix up the base later, since this glue's already starting to dry up between the legs and the top. And I have to apply pressure so that the glue sets properly. So what I'm doing is using some scrap 2x2s I had and clamping down. Forgot to record this part because I was in rush mode, but I ended up re-gluing these legs and then reclamping them. And what I'm doing is using a chisel to take off that initial glue that I put on to make sure that when I put this onto the legs, it fits up nice and square. Now that I have that bottom piece all back and clamped up, it's time to go back to the original plan, which is now putting this top onto the base and clamping it down how it should have been the first time. But the second time just adds character to it. And these builds normally don't go as planned, and you just kind of have to be adaptable and just face whatever comes to you. And in this case, that's what happened to me. So yeah, just going back and forth, making sure all this is flush and square. I had some problems with this corner here not touching perfectly, but nothing another clamp couldn't fix, so I'm throwing that one in there at an angle and really wrenching this one down. Now it's time to address those holes I drilled through, and I'm using this wood plug bit and just going with the same grain on a similar piece. I mean, it all looks the same, but on a similar piece of wood. And then taking some glue and filling the holes with that. And for this one on the right, or whatever side that may be oriented to you, I had to re-drill the hole and then to like make sure that the plug fit properly. Hammer that in, and once it's all dry, I use this Japanese saw to get it flush with the rest of the wood. Once it's been long enough for that glue to set, it's time to unclamp everything. And this is always one of my favorite parts of the build because even though it's rough, you can see the full shape of the design. Unfortunately, that happiness is pretty short-lived because the step that follows is most woodworkers' least favorite part about woodworking, and that's sanding. But like most things in life, the things that you should do but like the least produce the greatest outcome. The sanding process for this project was particularly tedious because of all the turns and corners of the design, and because my hand sander couldn't reach everywhere when I was going through and doing the passes. I had to use a chisel to get some excess glue off in some areas, and I had a good portion of hand sanding to do pretty much everywhere. I went from 80 grit up to 120 grit sandpaper for this and got the shop pretty messy in the process. After 4 hours of sanding, I was satisfied with how the design looked sharp but smooth at the same time, and I was ready to move on to the next step of prepping for stain. I'm taping off the oak slats here because I'm staining them a darker color like I did in my past builds of my 31 line design, or what I'm calling the 31 line. And I'm calling it that because it's 3 oak slats and then 1 on the other side. And I don't know, I thought it sounded cool, so we're going to roll with it. After 2 coats of the darker stain, I'm ready to take the tape off and see how I did. Usually the tape works pretty well, but there's some minor bleed through in some areas that I need to go back in with some sandpaper to get rid of. Now that those lines are nice and straight, I can move on to staining the rest of the piece. And this is where you can really start to see the wood come alive, and that's why it's one of my favorite parts as well. Going over with this lighter coat, I'm not too worried about hitting those oak slats staining the darker color because you really won't be able to see it. And it's important to note that before I recorded this piece, I started off by staining the underside of the base so it's protected as well. Just not as fun to show that part because it's not as cool. But yeah, so I'm staining the top here and then I work my way through staining the rest of the plant stand.
Write a few songs, loving and leaving and get too stoned. Bottle and a pistol by my side, the devil's always along for the ride. We ride down to the creek by the water. I've been baptized by the preacher's daughter. Lucky for me, no, he never caught us, so.
Like I said earlier, when you stain the whole piece, it really makes the wood pop and come alive. But it also shows all of your imperfections and places where you may have missed sanding, as well as spots where there's still some glue. And glue does not look good at all when you stain over it. So because of this, after my first coat of stain, I look to find where those imperfections are, and I go back and I hand sand all of those areas that I think could use some work. Since I had a lot of imperfections and did a lot of hand sanding, I had a ton of dust. So I used this shop blower and just blew off the excess dust that was all over my piece, and it actually worked pretty well. And then after I got the piece all nice and clean, I go through with a second and then a third coat to get that stain really set into the piece and make sure it looks good. After adding 3 coats of stain, I move on to adding a semi-gloss finish, which is the same clear coat I've used in my past projects. I really like the sheen that it adds, how it makes the piece stand out, and that it's really good for protecting the wood even further. So here what I'm doing is using a foam brush to try and add as even of a coat as I can to the entire design. And then once it dries out, I look past all of the vendor recommendations to strictly not use steel wool, and I use steel wool after applying this finish. I don't know why the vendor recommendations are against this, but it's what I've always used and I think that it works pretty well. But the reason why you have to use anything at all is because this finish leaves a bumpy texture after you apply it. So I repeat this process of applying the finish, sanding it down with steel wool, and then cleaning off the surface a total of 3 times. And then once I'm done doing that, the project is complete.
Now here you go again, you say you want your freedom. Well, who am I to keep you down? It's only right that you should play the way you feel it. But listen carefully.
Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'll see you next time.